Christopher Wilder lived a life full of excitement and luxury. As a race car driver, he had a flashy lifestyle that included fancy cars and high-end cameras. He easily attracted many young women who were unaware of his dark side. In February 1984, Wilder began a horrifying journey across the country. Over 7 weeks, he harmed and took the lives of at least 8 young women who were hopeful models. This tragic series of events led to him being known as the Beauty Queen Killer. Christopher Wilder was born on March 13, 1945, in Sydney, Australia. He was the oldest of 4 sons to an American father, Coley Chapman Wilder, a naval officer, and an Australian mother, June Wilder. His life began with a dramatic twist. During his birth, he turned in such a way that his neck got tangled in the umbilical cord. He was stuck and began to suffocate, with his heartbeat becoming barely noticeable. Any attempt to pull him out only made the situation worse. At that time, cesarean sections weren't commonly performed. Seeing their efforts failing, the doctors decided to call the hospital priest to administer the last rites. Miraculously, as they prayed for him, his vital signs completely stabilized. This early brush with death left his parents deeply traumatized, leading them to be extremely overprotective. Despite their vigilant care, it wasn't long before another frightening incident occurred. One summer afternoon, while the family was enjoying their pool, 2-year-old Christopher dove into the water right under his Uncle John's watchful eye. He was underwater just long enough to lose consciousness. Fortunately, his father, skilled in emergency response, quickly applied resuscitation techniques. After a few tense minutes, Christopher was revived. The incident led to many health problems for Christopher during his early years, including seizures. This also affected him psychologically, making him feel fragile compared to other kids. From a young age, Christopher's father instilled military discipline in him, with his mother's full blessing. To Christopher, his dad was everything, and his greatest wish was to grow up to be strong like him, leaving behind the frail and sickly image that marked his childhood. Christopher's teenage years were stable. He enjoyed a privileged life, was educated in top schools, and had a family that was always ready to do everything for him. However, this wasn't enough to satisfy him. Puberty increased his desire to be a powerful person. He longed to influence and dominate others, so his behavior became rebellious. In the evenings, he would sneak out of his house with the intention of lurking around. When he spotted girls walking by themselves, he would quietly follow them to their homes and then watch them through the windows as they changed clothes. Satisfying her sexual appetite was her only desire. The proximity of his home to the sea made the beach his favorite place to spend his afternoons. Like any Australian boy, surfing became one of his favorite pastimes, and it made him gain muscle. No longer an insecure boy, the transformation allowed him to become confident and attractive to young girls, but not because he wanted to date them. His intentions were darker. In the summer of 1963, a few months before his 17th birthday, he and his friends were enjoying another afternoon of surfing and beers when they decided to walk the beach in search of girls. They spotted a 13-year-old girl sunbathing. They offered her a few drinks, and Christopher began making advances towards her. She felt uneasy and tried to leave, but he grabbed her arm, led her behind a dune, and abused her while his friends watched without intervening. He left her there and walked away as if nothing had happened. The girl reported the incident, and Christopher, a known figure in the area, was soon arrested. He pleaded guilty, but his parents interceded on his behalf, claiming that he was a bright young man with a promising future that would be ruined in prison. The court took these arguments into consideration and granted him probation with a series of precautionary measures. One of the steps taken was for him to undergo psychiatric treatment involving electroconvulsive therapy. This involved administering short bursts of electric shocks to the brain, with intensities varying from 75 to 470 volts. The purpose was to treat what was described as a damaged mind. In truth, his condition didn't improve. Instead, his disturbing fantasies only grew. Around the same time, Christopher became fixated on a book called The Collector by John Fowles. The story follows a solitary entomologist who collects butterflies and becomes obsessed with a beautiful art student. This chilling narrative appeared to inspire him deeply. The therapist who treated him during this time knew he was fascinated by this book, which he had nearly memorized. For him, it represented the ultimate fantasy of having complete power over another person. On a warm day in January 1965, two 15-year-old girls, Mary Ann Schmidt and Christine Sherrick, went with their younger siblings to Wanda Beach, an ideal spot for surfing. That afternoon, the wind was too strong for a peaceful stroll, so the group decided to take shelter in the dunes. Mary Ann told her younger siblings that she and Christine would go fetch their backpacks from the rocky area at the south end of the beach, and then they'd return to head home together. Hours passed and the girls never showed up. The next morning, their lifeless bodies were discovered in the sand. Christine had been stabbed 14 times, and Mary Ann's throat was deeply slashed. Their undergarments were completely torn, a clear indication of an attempted rape. The brutality of the crime shocked Sydney and became front-page news in both local and international media. Over 7,000 people were investigated, and Christopher was a key suspect since his physical description and psychological profile matched that of the perpetrator. Despite these coincidences, there was no evidence to charge him, and his DNA did not match the sample the police had from the assailant. By early 1967, it seemed like the turmoil in Christopher's life was behind him. While out for a walk in Sydney's Palm Beach, he met Christine Paluk. They connected instantly and quickly became friends. Their bond deepened, blossoming into a romantic relationship. He loved taking her to the best surfing spots and driving around the city together. To fully win her heart, he often asked Christine to also invite her younger sister, who was 15. After a month of dating, Christine began to feel uneasy, especially because he often looked at her younger sister in a peculiar way. Alarm bells rang when what seemed like a latent violent streak became glaringly apparent during a dinner at his parents' house. That day, without any apparent reason, Christopher suddenly became enraged and punched out a dining room window. Despite this disturbing event, their love overcame the turmoil, and the couple got married after a year. From day one, Christopher gave free rein to all his sexual fantasies, and if his wife refused, he would beat her until she agreed. More than sexual intercourse, those intimate encounters were rape. The hell was short. Just a week after the marriage, the wife found underwear and pornographic photos of young girls in her husband's car. She decided to end the relationship and, accompanied by her mother, went to the police and accused him of sexual abuse and physical violence. She also told them of her suspicion that he might be the killer of the teenage girls in Wanda Beach. Once the report was made, the police began their investigation. Christopher knew he was under scrutiny and could be arrested at any moment, but as usual, luck was on his side. There was no solid case against him. However, the warning prompted him to distance himself from the situation, and with his father's help, he emigrated to the United States. By early 1969, he had settled in Boynton Beach, Florida. He adapted easily and found his calling as an electrical contractor and construction engineer. The real estate boom at the time quickly made him a lot of money, and he became even wealthier when he ventured into the real estate business. With his newfound wealth, Christopher bought a luxurious bachelor pad. He had two public passions: photography and competing in amateur car races. He bought several high-end cameras and set up a photo studio in his condominium. This hobby soon became a ploy to seduce beautiful young women. Using his charisma and approachable appearance, he posed as a talent scout for famous magazines, thereby attracting vulnerable victims to fulfill his sexual perversions. Christopher spent considerable time roaming the beaches of South Florida, looking for women until one day he was arrested in Pompano Beach for demanding that two girls pose nude for him. The police detained him, but not for long. He only had to pay a hefty fine to be released. 3 years later, while at a shopping mall, he posed as a photographer and convinced a schoolgirl to allow him to take pictures of her for a prominent magazine of the time. Upon arriving at his van, he drugged her and forced her to have sex with him inside the vehicle. The girl fled and filed a complaint with the police. He was arrested again but managed to negotiate the charges, claiming that his mind shut down on weekends. As a result, he was granted probation with a therapy regimen. Despite his ongoing criminal record, Christopher had managed to evade any formal charges until the mid-1980s, when he persuaded a teenager to get into his car for a photo shoot in a rural location. There, he committed a horrific sexual assault. Arrested and taken to court, he quickly pleaded guilty, but manipulated the jury into believing he would seek immediate psychiatric care, resulting in a verdict in his favor. He was sentenced to 5 years of probation with the condition of attending therapy sessions during that period. At this time, Christopher was seeking a genuine and deep relationship. It was then that he met Elizabeth Kenyon, a 19-year-old who had recently been an Orange Bowl princess and a finalist in Miss Florida. Their relationship was brief. He quickly proposed marriage, but she declined, citing the age difference as too significant, though they remained on good terms. It had been more than 10 years since he last saw his parents, and using this as a reason, he persuaded the court to allow him to travel to Australia. Once permission was granted, he returned to Sydney in 1982. It didn't take long for him to resume his previous modus operandi. He took with him his cameras and a bunch of cards with a false name to pose as a model photographer. One afternoon, he was able to trick two girls under the usual pretext and drove them to an isolated area of the beach where he forced them to undress and pose suggestive poses. Seeing the fear in the teenage girls, he put them in his car and drove them to his hotel. While there, he threatened to beat them. He tied them up, abused them for hours, and then released them. But he was arrested and charged with kidnapping and sexual assault. The case went to an initial detention hearing in a local magistrate's court. The accused didn't seem worried about the charges and claimed that it had all been a misunderstanding. His parents paid a substantial amount of $400,000 for his bail, and he was allowed to return to Florida to handle business matters. Christopher promised to return for the hearing scheduled for April 1984. This situation put him at a crossroads. He was unable to control his impulses, was about to be tried in Australia, and was already known in the United States. He couldn't risk being charged again. The only solution he could think of was a dark one: ensure his victims could not live to tell their stories. Back in Florida, he resumed his passion for cars, and on February 26, 1984, he participated in the Miami Grand Prix with his Porsche. There, he approached Rosario Gonzalez, who was working as a product promoter. Rosario shared her aspirations to be a model and her recent participation in Miss Florida. He persuaded her to have a quick meeting in a nearby cafe to arrange a photo shoot for her portfolio. She agreed, and at noon, they were seen leaving the location in his car. Rosario lived with her parents, who knew she was supposed to return home between 5 and 6 p.m. When she was going to be late, she always notified them. For this reason, and because she did not make any contact, her parents quickly filed a missing person report. Witnesses confirmed that the young woman had left the racetrack between noon and 1 p.m. with a Caucasian man around 30 years old. Rosario's car was found parked near a shopping plaza, but there were no traces of her. The Miami Herald published a profile of the suspect. By then, Elizabeth, his former girlfriend, had become a teacher for children with special needs. On March 5, 1984, in the late afternoon after finishing her workday, she headed to the gym as was her routine. After leaving the building, she exchanged a few words with the security guard and then walked away in her Chrysler. She made a brief stop at her usual gas station and, by chance, ran into Christopher. He wasted no time in asking if she wanted to model for him in a session, and she happily agreed, so they continued their journey together. That night, Elizabeth hadn't returned to her apartment, but her roommate wasn't worried, assuming she was visiting her parents in Pompano Beach, Florida, about 50 miles away. The next day, when Elizabeth didn't show up for work, her family, knowing it was out of character for her to leave without notice, decided to report her missing. Frustrated with the slow pace of the police investigation, her parents hired a private investigator. With his expertise, he quickly linked Elizabeth's case to that of the young woman who disappeared during the Miami Grand Prix. He also recognized similarities between the ex-boyfriend and the suspect described in the press. The detective visited Christopher's residence, but when questioned, Christopher claimed he hadn't spoken to Elizabeth for over a month and had no idea where she could be. As soon as the detective left, Christopher destroyed all his pornographic material. He then packed his belongings, including his cameras, withdrew $50,000 from his bank accounts, started his car, and headed north towards Georgia, resigned to the fact that his capture was imminent. After driving for 2 hours to northern Florida, he stopped at the first shopping center he found on the evening of March 19th. With camera in hand and his fake business cards, he approached a 21-year-old woman named Teresa Ann Ferguson, who was shopping. He offered her a modeling job, and his words swayed her. He led her to his car and opened the trunk to show her the equipment to convince her of the job's legitimacy. However, when she was momentarily distracted, he grabbed her by the hair and forced her into the trunk. He drove to a marshy area in northern Florida. Ensuring they were alone, he opened the trunk, dragged Teresa out, and strangled her. Without hesitation, he placed her body on the marsh's edge to conceal the heinous crime. In his frantic journey, Christopher made his way to Tallahassee, the capital of Florida, about 4 hours away. His first stop was Governor's Square Mall. In his usual manner, he approached college student Linda Grover, complimented her beauty, and filled her head with fantasies of being on the cover of Vogue if she agreed to work with him. Initially, she refused, but eventually his persistence led her to agree to see the cameras in his car. When he opened the trunk, he pulled out a blanket, restrained her with it, and forced her into the car. He fled the scene, crossing into Bainbridge, Georgia. There, he dragged Linda to a cheap motel where he raped her and subjected her to various tortures. After 2 hours of this nightmare, while he slept, Linda managed to sneak to the bathroom and started screaming. He grabbed all her belongings and escaped. Linda was rescued and identified her attacker from photographs shown by the police. Meanwhile, Christopher fled the state. He drove all night, covering a 9-hour journey to Beaumont, Texas, where he took a break in the parking lot of Lamar University. There, he noticed a nursing student named Terry Walden. Despite deploying his usual charm, she flatly rejected him. On March 23rd, he returned to the mall and was again met with rejections, leaving him deeply frustrated and considering leaving empty-handed. However, he then saw Terry again. Thinking she might have changed her mind, he approached and insisted once more, but her response was the same as before. Enraged by her rejection, he followed her unnoticed to the parking lot. As she opened the door of her car, he suddenly appeared and pushed her inside. Driven by his anger, he took her to a secluded spot where he stabbed her 43 times in the chest, then dumped her body in a nearby canal. He fled in her car. During the search for the nursing student, Texas authorities found Christopher's car abandoned in the mall parking lot. There, they discovered hair samples belonging to Teresa, confirming his responsibility for her death on Merritt Island. By March 25th, Christopher was in Oklahoma, hunting for another victim at the local Penn Square Mall. There, he met a 21-year-old woman who dreamed of becoming a model. His tactic worked better than ever. It was not difficult to convince her to come to his car under the pretense of conducting a photo session for $100. He drove 180 miles north to Newton, Kansas, checked into room 30 of a motel, and abused her until dawn. After breakfast, with absolute coldness, he drove his victim 90 miles northeast of Newton near Junction City, Kansas, where he stabbed her to death and dumped her body near Milford Reservoir. By March 29th, Christopher was in Colorado, continuing his spree. This time, he was at Grand Junction. He started looking for a specific type, a girl with a cowgirl look. He found his target in 19-year-old Cheryl Lynn Bonaventura. Well-dressed and polite, he introduced himself as a modeling agent, and she was thrilled with the proposal, as it was her dream. Naively, she voluntarily got into his car, agreeing to the plan to leave the city. Along the way, they stopped at a restaurant in Silverton where, in front of the staff, they pretended to be a married couple heading to Las Vegas. They arrived the next morning at the Four Corners Monument, where the states of Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico meet. They took a photo at the iconic spot and continued their journey to Page, Arizona, near the Utah border. There, Christopher booked a room under the same pretense of being a married couple. On March 31st, Cheryl's family reported her missing to the police, though they hoped it was just a misunderstanding or an act of rebellion due to her age. Unfortunately, that morning, Cheryl and Christopher's journey took them to the Kanab River in Utah, a remote area with deserts, mountains, and cliffs. As they silently admired the scenery, Christopher unexpectedly stabbed his victim and then shot her, leaving her lifeless. He abandoned her body in a desert area. Christopher's journey continued to Las Vegas, Nevada. His plan was to attend a modeling event, which for him was a paradise filled with naive girls eager to succeed in the tough world of flashes and glamour. Camera in hand, he arrived and sat in the front row to scout his potential victims. At the end of the day, after talking with several teenagers, he focused his attention on 17-year-old Michelle Lynn Korfman. She had driven over 25 miles from her home in Boulder City, Nevada. Nervous about participating in her first casting, she had asked her family and friends to let her go alone. They talked, and Christopher filled her with compliments. Subsequently, Michelle changed her clothes and left the mall in his company. It was April 1st. As soon as Las Vegas authorities alerted the FBI about the disappearance of the young woman at the modeling event, the agents reacted swiftly, requesting all photographs taken during the evening. A photographer promptly handed over 5 rolls of film. After developing them, they could see Michelle walking the runway, with Christopher intently focusing on her. Meanwhile, like the others before her, Michelle suffered violence and torture at his hands. Her body was left at a rest stop in Southern California. On April 4th, Christopher reached the opposite coast of the United States, in Torrance, California. There, he went to a shopping mall, where he saw a girl filling out a job application. She was Tina Marie Risico, 16 years old. He offered her the usual plan and the same $100, much more than she would earn as a store employee. The young girl was hesitant but excused herself, saying she needed to get home. Her rejection did not sit well with him. He pointed a gun at her and demanded she get into his car without making any noise. Frightened, she complied, and then sat in silence for 2 hours while he drove to San Diego. Once in the city, Christopher rented a room and unleashed his usual barrage of abuses against the girl. During a break, he turned on the TV and was shocked to see a special bulletin announcing him as a new addition to the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list, specifically linking him to the disappearance and murder of several young women. He was dubbed the Beauty Queen Killer. In a turn of events, he chose not to kill Tina, but instead coerced her into becoming his accomplice to lure more victims. In exchange for her cooperation, he promised to release her in the next city. Terrified, she agreed. He started driving back east and arrived in Merrillville, Indiana on April 10th. There, Tina kept her word. At the South Lake Mall, she convinced 16-year-old Dawnette Sue Wilt to join them, assuring the young girl that another woman's presence meant safety. In the parking lot, Christopher pulled out a gun and forced Dawnette into the car. Once at a nearby hotel, Tina witnessed him attacking Dawnette for 2 consecutive days. Christopher kept the TV on and saw another FBI bulletin, this time Tina's mother pleading for her daughter's life. Panicked, he ordered the girls to grab their belongings and get into the car immediately. He then drove non-stop to the border of New York. Considering it too risky to travel with both, he left his car in a wooded area of Penn Yan. While Tina stayed in the car under threat of death if she left, he took Dawnette into the small forest. Suddenly, he began to strangle her. She fought back fiercely, but he pulled out a knife and stabbed her twice in the chest. Thinking her dead, he walked away. Fortunately, Dawnette was still alive. With great effort, she managed to drag herself to the side of the road. A truck driver took her to the hospital in Penn Yan, where they managed to save her life. Hours later, she was able to report what had happened to the county sheriff. She detailed her attacker and the young woman accompanying him. She described the vehicle they were traveling in and their intended escape destination, Canada. This triggered a police operation to capture the fugitive. Christopher drove to Victor, New York, just 50 minutes from where he had abandoned Dawnette. He parked at the Eastview Mall, exited the car violently with a gun in hand, and kidnapped Beth Elaine Dodge, a 33-year-old woman who was passing time while waiting for her daughter to come out of daycare. He forced her into his vehicle and commanded Tina to drive Beth's car. After a short drive to the outskirts of the city, he stopped next to an abandoned gravel quarry. He pointed the gun at Beth, led her to a densely wooded area, and shot her in the back. Then he made Tina transfer all belongings from the other car to the stolen one. In his way, Christopher reassured Tina that he would not harm her and chose to drive to Logan Airport in Boston. There, he bought her a ticket back to California and set her free. While in Boston, he headed north to Beverly, Massachusetts, attempting to kidnap 19-year-old Carol, who he assaulted suddenly on the street. However, he was unsuccessful as she managed to escape screaming for help. Descriptions of both the vehicle and the suspect were circulated among patrol officers, making it only a matter of hours before the serial killer would be caught. On the afternoon of April 13th, needing directions to Canada, he stopped at a gas station in Colebrook, New Hampshire. However, 2 state troopers recognized him and approached. At that moment, Christopher reached for the gun in the car, threatened the officers, and a struggle ensued with one of them. Suddenly, the revolver went off twice. One bullet seriously injured the officer, while the other struck the killer directly in the heart. Christopher died instantly. Throughout his spree across the United States, he kidnapped, tortured, raped, and murdered 8 young women, but it is believed there were more victims. Christopher Wilder was cremated in Florida, leaving behind a personal fortune of over $7 million. In June 1986, a court-appointed arbitrator ruled that this money should be divided among the families of his victims. There were numerous missed opportunities to stop Christopher's spree of violence, which escalated into serial killings. However, his parents helped him evade punishment. Jurors were swayed by his false promises of seeking psychiatric help, and the victims were left at the mercy of his twisted mind and horrific fantasies. And that concludes today's Unreal True Crime. Remember to subscribe and hit like to let me know you appreciate my work. Until next time. In Kern County, there are many murders each year, but the murder of Yvette Pena in a Bakersfield motel caught the public's eye and became especially infamous. This tragic event occurred in 2011 and was shocking in its brutality. What made this case even more remarkable was the individual who confessed to the crime, a merciless man covered in tattoos. His chilling demeanor and the gruesome details of the murder captivated and horrified the community. Born on March 7, 1988, in Bakersfield, California, Jaime Osuna's early life unfolded in a tumultuous manner. His mother, Michelle, was just 19 years old at the time, while little is known about his father except that he was 21, rebellious, and undisciplined. Jaime's father displayed abusive tendencies toward Michelle from the start, even resorting to kicking her in the stomach while she was pregnant with Jaime. This cruel act left lasting harm on Jaime, even before he took his first breath. Some speculate that this incident may have contributed to Jaime's ear malformation and potentially impacted his brain development. Recognizing the abusive nature of her husband, Michelle made the courageous decision to divorce him. Soon afterward, she met Jeff, a man with whom she felt an instant connection, and it appeared that Jeff would step into the role of Jaime's new stepfather. Jaime's biological father, however, strongly opposed this development. Despite Michelle's desire to sever ties with him, he persisted in causing trouble. One fateful night, he threatened Jeff by holding a knife to his throat. Thankfully, the situation didn't escalate further. He was apprehended and a restraining order was issued. This marks the last mention of Jaime's biological father in his story. Shortly thereafter, Michelle married Jeff, and they began cohabiting with Jaime and his brother, who was 2 years Jaime's senior. This is where the story takes a dark and troubling turn. While Jeff desired Michelle, he seemed less enthusiastic about assuming the role of a stepfather. Regrettably, this resulted in a period of misery for Jaime, while his older brother was somewhat spared, having gone to live with their grandparents once they became aware of Jeff's abusive behavior. It remains unclear why Jaime wasn't also taken in by his grandparents, but it seems that they declined to care for him, leaving one to wonder why they would reject a 3-year-old child. It's important to note that Michelle also made the choice to prioritize her relationship with Jeff over the well-being of her 2 young sons. Jeff's abusive actions were well documented through accounts from Michelle, Jaime, and records from hospitals and law enforcement agencies. On one occasion, during a road trip with Michelle and Jaime secured in a baby carrier in the back seat, Jaime's crying provoked Jeff to a point where he began shouting at the child. Shockingly, he then threw the baby carrier out of the moving car. Fortunately, the baby carrier landed safely, and Jamie displayed no visible injuries. However, subsequent examinations revealed severe brain damage that could have resulted from this traumatic incident. Around the age of 5, another distressing incident marred Jamie's already tumultuous childhood. He accidentally spilled some juice on the floor, which infuriated Jeff. In a fit of anger, Jeff grabbed a belt and began to mercilessly beat the young boy. This time, Michelle intervened by calling the police. Jeff was subsequently arrested on charges of child cruelty due to the visible marks on Jamie's body. However, the charges were relatively lenient and, disconcertingly, Jeff returned home just 10 days later, with Michelle still standing by his side. Even after they had their own children, Jeff continued to mistreat Jamie, depriving him of proper meals and sometimes serving his food on the floor. Jaime increasingly felt like an outsider in his own home. Michelle, though aware of her past mistakes, found herself unable to rectify the deep-seated damage that had been done. At the age of 12, Jaime finally managed to escape the clutches of his abusive household and went to live with his grandparents. Everyone had come to realize that Jeff's mistreatment of Jamie would not cease. It was during this time that they began to notice the emotional numbness that had gripped Jaime from a tender age. Michelle described it as if his soul had been torn away, leaving him apathetic towards everything and everyone around him. This period marked the onset of Jaime's disturbing behavior. He began cooking animals in a nearby forest, and in the absence of anyone at home, subjected his own pet cat to chilling ordeals, locking it in the refrigerator and even the oven. He also turned to self-harm, as it seemed to be the only way for him to feel something, anything, in a world where he felt utterly numb. At the age of 15, Jaime took a dire turn when he brutally stabbed another boy, leaving him gravely wounded but fortunate to survive the ordeal. This criminal act led to Jaime's incarceration in a juvenile correctional facility, where he would spend the next 4 years. It was during this period that Michelle finally confronted the gravity of her irresponsibility toward Jaime, resulting in her decision to divorce Jeff. A few years later, Jeff met his demise due to a heart attack. Given his abusive history, it's conceivable that Jaime might have inflicted harm upon him if he had not passed away. On September 14, 2007, Jaime was released from prison at the age of 19. By this time, he had acquired a notorious reputation as a troublemaker, deeply entrenched in gang activities. He showed little interest in education or gainful employment, instead opting for a lifestyle characterized by revelry and association with his gang affiliates. The turning point in this harrowing narrative occurred in December 2008 when a 16-year-old boy's birthday party took a rather unexpected turn. This was no typical birthday celebration adorned with Mickey Mouse piñatas and cheerful decorations. Instead, it drew a crowd from the gritty underbelly of society, and the absence of any responsible adult to maintain order was notable. This unconventional gathering had been organized by the birthday boy's mother, who was known for her laissez-faire attitude. Joelle Castellano, a 37-year-old single mother of 3, played a central role in this intriguing tale. She decided to host a party for underage youths, which, while undoubtedly irresponsible, didn't spell the end of the world. As the evening progressed, however, things took a turn for the chaotic, with Joelle's dance with a young man catching the eye of her nephew. It seemed that this young relative became envious, possibly due to his own romantic feelings for his aunt, leading him to want to keep others away from her. In his quest to intimidate the young man, Joel pointed to Jaime, who, despite not yet having the distinctive facial tattoos he would later acquire, stood at around 5'3". However, it was Jaime's demeanor and attitude that made him an intimidating presence, perhaps more so than anyone else in the room. Jaime agreed to confront the young man, proceeding to the kitchen, where he retrieved a knife and warned the boy to steer clear of Joel. The young man, believing that Jaime wouldn't actually follow through, issued a challenge. However, Jaime defied expectations and indeed stabbed the young man, leading to his return to prison. But something had changed this time. Jaime couldn't shake one thought from his mind. He had fallen head over heels in love with Joel. It wasn't just because of the recent stabbing incident, but a genuine and profound love. As they say, love can compel us to commit acts beyond imagination. Jaime no longer cared about his circumstances. He believed he could win over Joel, despite their age gap, his imprisonment, and their initial encounter involving a stabbing. Jaime began sending heartfelt love letters to Joel, and eventually, she too succumbed to his affections. Thus, they embarked on a long-distance relationship. 11 months later, when Jamie completed his sentence, Joel picked him up in her truck. However, her confidence wavered upon seeing that Jamie had acquired facial tattoos, raising doubts about the seriousness of their relationship. Despite all the waiting, Jamie's eagerness prevailed as he suggested to Joel that they spend the night in a motel. Joelku agreed, albeit under the impression that it would be a one-night affair. Yet Jaime, known as the sharpshooter, proved remarkably effective, as that single night led to Joel becoming pregnant. With this development, she felt increasingly inclined to establish a lasting relationship with him. A mere 3 months later, they sealed their commitment in marriage. Jaime made solemn promises to Joel, assuring her that he understood the hardships of growing up in a fractured family and vowing to be a devoted father and husband. However, even before their child came into the picture, he exhibited abusive behavior towards Joel. It's at this point in the story that he began to adopt characteristics reminiscent of the Joker, not to sensationalize the narrative, but because there is a noticeable parallel. His abuse towards Joel wasn't solely physical. It had a strong psychological element, perhaps driven by the belief that this form of harm could be even more devastating. An example of this occurred during one heated argument when things spiraled out of control. Jaime seized the ashes of Joel's deceased mother from a vase and fled with them. He was keenly aware that Joel had not yet come to terms with her mother's passing, and this act prompted her to call the police. Jamie was arrested, but the ashes were never recovered. This unfortunate incident resulted in Jamie being sent back to prison, causing him to miss the birth of his child. Upon his release, Joel granted him another chance, hoping that, with the child's arrival, Jamie would take on the role of a responsible father. Unfortunately, this turned out to be a futile endeavor. Shortly thereafter, Jaime shifted his focus from physical harm to inflicting emotional distress on Joel. She did something that greatly disturbed individuals like him who craved attention. She ignored him completely. Regardless of what he said or did, it no longer affected her. One day, in an attempt to provoke a reaction from Joel, Jaime pushed her 7-year-old son off the bed, all while keeping his gaze fixed on her. His tactics proved successful. She became visibly upset and fetched a knife from the kitchen. In a stern tone, she warned him, "Mess with me, but never with my kids." At that moment, Jaime's face betrayed his surprise and fear. He hadn't anticipated such a response. Frightened, he reached out to his gang to extricate him from the situation. While outside the house, Jaime turned to methamphetamines, which explains his current aged appearance, making him resemble a 60-year-old man. Now that he no longer officially resided with Joel, he commenced stalking her from outside her home. Joel called the police, leading to Jamie's arrest and a 7-month prison sentence for violating his parole. However, within a week of his release, he resumed his harassment of Joelle. She would spot him outside her window, his gaze unwavering, and he would make menacing phone calls, threatening her and her children. Joelle contacted the police once again, but upon their arrival they failed to locate Jamie. Days passed with no trace of him. Then, on November 8, 2011, Joelle received a chilling call from Jamie, in which he uttered the sinister words, "Check the news. I just killed a woman at the Morocco Motel." Naturally, Joel's immediate response was to contact the police. However, they didn't take her seriously. What transpired next is where the story takes an eerie turn, as it was 5 days after this call that a motel employee discovered a gruesome crime scene in one of the motel's rooms. The victim was a 37-year-old woman named Yvette, a mother of 6. Details are scarce, but it appears to have been an exceedingly horrific crime scene. Investigators, who deemed it one of the most disturbing cases in their careers, found evidence of 2 knives and scissors used in the slow and torturous manner of death. Jaime, it seemed, harbored a sadistic streak. You might wonder how I have access to these gruesome details. Well, this wouldn't be his solitary murder, nor the most heinous. Even more chilling is the absence of any apparent motive for targeting this woman, strongly suggesting that she became a victim solely because of her resemblance to Joelle. Jaime would ultimately face arrest, trial, and sentencing for this horrifying murder. While incarcerated, Jaime took disturbing actions to further torment Joelle. He would occasionally contact Child Protective Services in an attempt to have her custody of her children revoked, knowing that this would inflict the most pain on her. He even went to the extent of trying to hire a hitman to eliminate her. However, because he communicated these intentions through letters, the police intercepted them before they could reach their intended recipient. These actions only added layers to the mask he wore, a facade he maintained to feel something, a desperate attempt to fill the void he had experienced as a child. The trial for the murder of Yvette dragged on for 5 years, during which Jamie displayed no remorse whenever he appeared in court. He would even wave and laugh at the victim's family. This extended trial was a result of Jamie's refusal to confess. It's worth noting that he managed to prolong the trial for more than half a decade by remaining silent. However, on March 24, 2017, just 3 days before the final trial, where the verdict was still uncertain, a news channel offered him an interview. They aimed to capitalize on his striking appearance to generate clicks and had planned to ask him challenging questions to elicit a confession. To everyone's astonishment, they didn't need to ask any questions because Jaime confessed to the murder of Yvette right at the start of the interview. It's evident that he did this to gain notoriety, as there is no doubt that he deliberately presented himself as a villain in the news. What corroborates this is his confession to 2 more murders, one at the age of 13 and the other at 19. The police initiated a search for the supposed victims based on Jamie's descriptions, since he hadn't provided any names. Given that he had spent his entire life in Bakersfield, the margin for error was minimal. However, the database did not yield any records of missing persons or unsolved murders that could be attributed to him. Therefore, it's highly likely that these claims are exaggerated. With all these confessions, Jaime was undoubtedly found guilty 3 days later. However, he did not receive the death penalty because of his confession on the day of the trial, which had caused a 5-year delay and wasted time and resources. Still, what remains perplexing to everyone is what happened next. Upon entering prison, he exhibited increasingly erratic behavior. He painted the walls of his cell with his own blood. On one fateful evening, he was placed in a cell with a man he harbored animosity towards, and he mercilessly stabbed him multiple times using a knife. He even inflicted a deep facial wound, requiring the victim to undergo 67 stitches. Jaime went so far as to request photographs of his victims as trophies, further underscoring the disturbing nature of his actions. He had earned a reputation as an inmate too dangerous to share a cell with anyone, but in a bewildering and illogical turn of events in March 2019, Jaime found himself with his first-ever cellmate, a 44-year-old man named Luis Romero. In 1992, at the tender age of 17, Luis, originally from Guatemala, had joined a gang in the United States and had taken someone's life during a confrontation with rival gang members. He had been sentenced to 27 years in prison and was on the verge of completing his sentence. However, in a confounding and irrational twist of fate, he was assigned to the same cell as Jaime, who had committed a more gruesome crime. Jaime was well aware of the extent of his own actions, having just committed them, boasting a lengthy history of criminal deeds. Moreover, he had been denied cellmates in the past because of the perceived danger he posed. Luis was merely 3 weeks away from regaining his freedom. In less than 24 hours since they had become cellmates, on the morning of March 9, 2019, when correctional officers came to inspect their cell, they stumbled upon an eerie sight. Jaime was smiling, wearing a collar. This collar was fashioned from various parts of Luis's body, and Jaime had gone as far as carving a grotesque, clown-like smile on Luis's face. He had toyed with his lifeless body, inscribed messages on the walls using blood, and declared, "I am the man of 1,000 faces." Now, the theories start to surface because it is evident that such an atrocity would require more than a mere hour. It would take many hours to commit such unspeakable acts. A correctional officer responsible for conducting a nighttime check reported that everything was in order, even though Luis's body indicated that the gruesome assault had already begun at that hour. Some guards attempted to justify this oversight by claiming that Jaime had placed a blanket to conceal the ongoing horror. But if an inmate places a blanket to obscure events behind a cell door, it is incumbent upon the guard to enter and investigate. What transpired here was not an isolated incident at this prison. It occurred at a prison which had gained notoriety due to allegations of guards organizing fights among inmates, all while placing bets on the outcomes. There exist videos of these fights, complete with a presenter and commentator. Furthermore, suspicions linger that this practice was employed when authorities sought to dispose of a troublesome inmate. They would orchestrate a fight, and when one participant was winning, they would shoot the other inmate, claiming they were intervening to save them. This case presents further complexity due to Jaime's clearly deteriorated mental state. It is evident that he harbors a fascination with the Joker, as evidenced by the blood-written phrases from the comics adorning his cell. It remains a mystery how he managed to procure razors to make knives, and his letter to a prosecutor inspired by the Joker and featuring the iconic "Why so serious" phrase raises questions. The letter also contains satanic messages, although it's doubtful he genuinely adheres to Satanism. These actions are likely undertaken for attention-seeking purposes. He received a diagnosis of an unknown form of schizophrenia within the spectrum, alongside antisocial personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, characterized by erratic behavior, which could explain his propensity to stab others without a clear provocation, and post-traumatic stress disorder. As a result, authorities declared him unfit to stand trial. Consequently, at the age of 33, it appears improbable that Jaime will face the death penalty, and he will likely spend the rest of his life behind bars. Jaime was undeniably unhinged, with a touch of clownishness. However, some might argue that he endured a troubled childhood. Nevertheless, the extremity of his actions remains unparalleled. Interestingly, his older brother, who sought refuge with their grandparents at a young age, has since transformed into a prosperous individual, a millionaire who enjoys driving sports cars and has a loving family. You've just witnessed another unreal true crime. Lock in your support by subscribing and turning on notifications. Your insight could open the next story. Have a good day. It was November 2020 in a small town in Chile, and a 12-year-old girl named Melissa Chavez was sleeping peacefully. Melissa, known for her bright smile and strong spirit, had faced a lot of tough times in her life. That night, she finally fell asleep easily, feeling safe and comfortable in her bed. What she didn't know was that this night was different. It was quiet and calm, but something was not right. This would be her last night, and the quiet around her was hiding the sad truth that her days of playing and laughing were about to end. Melissa Chavez was born in 2008 in the city of Coquimbo, Chile. She was the youngest child of Mirta Ardil and Denny Chavez, who already had 3 children. Although Mirta and Denny were really nice people, the couple decided to separate shortly after Melissa's birth after 8 years together. However, Melissa's paternal family continued to stay in touch with her. Her aunt, Gina Chavez, had a special affection for her and was always concerned for her well-being. To support her household as a single mother, Mirta worked various jobs, including in a bar. It was there she became very close friends with Maria Teresa Caballero, a co-worker. Almost every night after closing the bar, Maria would head to another nearby bar to work extra hours and earn more money. Since Mirta often accompanied her wherever she went, she eventually found employment at that place as well. One night, while Mirta was working at the bar, a regular customer approached her. His name was Luis. Although details about his life are scarce, it is known he was born in 1981, worked in a mine in Antofagasta, and lived with his then partner. This first encounter led to a romance that neither Luis's ongoing relationship nor their age difference, with Mirta being 8 years his senior, could prevent. Eventually, Luis left his partner and moved in with Mirta. By the year 2010, when Melissa was just 2 years old. By this time, Melissa's reserved nature was already evident, a trait that did not change much as she grew older. When she started school, she was kind but clearly found it hard to socialize and had few friends. Her shyness extended towards Luis, whom she saw as a stranger. However, in 2012, when her mother and he welcomed their first child together, the new sibling helped Melissa to start accepting Luis into her life. From that point forward, he also took on a role in her upbringing, offering her affection and care as if she were his own daughter. In turn, she began to refer to him as her father. This dynamic continued for a while, allowing Melissa to experience something she had almost never had, a sense of a home without fractures. But in 2014, Luis's behavior towards her changed. Everything occurred one afternoon when he was looking after her while Mirta was at work. Just then, without warning, what had always been merely affectionate treatment turned into inappropriate touching. Melissa first confided in one of her older sisters and only afterward alerted her mother. Around the same time, the girl was seen by her school's psychologist, to whom she also revealed what had happened. Faced with the alarming disclosure and the need to act to protect the girl, the news was communicated to the school's principal. She reached out to Mirta, and knowing how serious the situation was, the psychologist and they went to talk to the authorities. A complaint was filed through the psychologist and the prosecutor's office. The prosecutor's office immediately opened a case, and as a result, the courts decided to revoke the mother's custody of her daughter. Initially, it was thought that temporary custody would be given to the biological father. However, at that time, his situation was far from ideal. On the contrary, he was suffering from deep depression and struggling with alcoholism. As such, Melissa was placed in the care of her Aunt Gina. As for Myrta, in October 2014, the same court referred her to a family court program. The goal was to subject her to psychological and psychiatric assessments. Last but not least, to regain custody of her daughter, she was required to separate from Luis. During the process, she assured the authorities that she had indeed left him. However, the reality was that she was still in contact with him secretly. After 17 months, in March 2016, following supposed new evaluations that concluded Myrta was capable of resuming personal care of her daughter, the Child Protection Agency of Coquimbo returned the custody to her. Once Melissa was back home with her, the woman also took Luis back. Not content with having the girl and the aggressor live under the same roof, Myrta went to the authorities to retract the complaints against him. Since then, the agencies closed the investigation and did not follow up on the case. Several years passed with no records of any irregular events. It's unknown whether they didn't occur or were hidden. Thus, when September 2020 arrived, Myrta and Luis moved with Melissa and her younger brother to a 2-story house. The idea was to rebuild their lives in a calmer environment. Melissa, who was 12 years old at the time, had started secondary school and was in the 7th grade. As her mother had noticed, she was becoming a more independent young lady, which was evident, for example, in her long stays alone in her room, almost always listening to music. Sleeping in was another thing she enjoyed. And while she occasionally complained that her mother was too strict and demanding, overall, Melissa seemed content in the new neighborhood. But just then, Luis sought to resume the inappropriate behavior towards her, which had been suspended after the whole ordeal caused by the initial complaint. This time, fully aware of what was happening, Myrta chose to pretend nothing was happening. She didn't even make a complaint to protect her daughter. Instead, she often felt really jealous because Luis paid more attention to Melissa. The morning of November 26, 2020 proceeded with complete normality as everyone prepared to leave the house. But before that, Luis entered the teenager's room and, unlike previous instances, completed the act in its entirety. After the abuse, he left Melissa lying on her bed, devoid of any desire to move, deeply sad and ashamed. Around 10:30 that morning, Luis and his son left the house and took a taxi they had ordered in advance through an app. The sequence was recorded by the area's security cameras. While they were going to a vaccination day at the Sun School in the city center, Myrta was losing the battle against her inner demons. Alone with her daughter at home, the woman took a knife from the kitchen and went upstairs to Melissa's bedroom. At that time, the girl had succumbed to sleep amidst tears and despair. Once in front of her, her mother attacked her, causing multiple injuries that left her agonizing. Then, Myrta sent text messages to her dentist to arrange an appointment. Afterward, she returned to Melissa's room and set fire to the lower part of the bed, where the young girl had already lost all signs of life. It was just after 11 a.m. when closed-circuit cameras recorded her leaving the home. After stopping at a store to withdraw money, Myrta took a taxi she had ordered and went to her dental appointment. Once again, her movements were captured by cameras. Barely 7 minutes after her departure, neighbors noticed smoke coming from the house and contacted emergency services. Meanwhile, Luis and his son, on their way back, saw the fire truck speeding past them. As they approached their home, Luis could see the firefighter struggling to control the flames engulfing his house. Shocked and incredulous, he called Mirta. She confirmed that she had left Melissa sleeping. Upon receiving this information, his distress was uncontrollable, so much so that he even tried to enter, but the authorities prevented him. Meanwhile, neighbors tried to offer support and calm him down. Once the team managed to partially control the fire, they identified that it had originated in one of the bedrooms. Upon entering, they found Melissa's lifeless body, which had not been completely consumed by the fire. Initially, rescuers suggested that smoke inhalation might have been the cause of her death. As for Mirta, she returned home, ready to pretend. Already notified of the tragedy, both she and Luis appeared devastated in front of the neighbors and the television cameras present. Unaware of the truth, Luis demanded justice, stating, "The person responsible, they're going to have to pay. They will have to pay for everything they did." Once Melissa's remains were transferred to the morgue, the investigation at the scene continued, and investigators collected some kitchen utensils and other items from the house for further analysis. Early findings led to the initial hypothesis of death by smoke inhalation being dismissed, and the possibility of third-party involvement began to gain traction. In the preliminary autopsy report, forensic experts noted that the body showed signs of blunt force trauma and puncture wounds. While the prosecutor requested to wait for the final results, the information somehow leaked, and soon, neighbors took to the streets demanding justice for Melissa and expressing their fear of a criminal loose in the area. After the forensic analyses were completed, and while waiting for the detailed and definitive report, Melissa's body was released to her family for the wake and subsequent burial. At the funeral, Mirta urged anyone with relevant information to cooperate in the search for the truth and clarification of the case. Visibly affected, Luis did the same. However, suspicions were directed at the victim's mother, especially considering she had been the last to leave the house on that fateful day. Others claimed to have seen an older man leaving just before the smoke was noticed. This last theory was convenient for Mirta, who clung to it. However, upon reviewing the security cameras around the house, investigators found no evidence of the alleged presence of this individual. Therefore, they decided to pause this line of inquiry while continuing to search for new clues. Meanwhile, since their involvement could not be entirely ruled out, Luis and Mirta were summoned as suspects. On that occasion, both repeated their version of events. Additionally, their cell phones were made available to the authorities. Shortly after, the autopsy results confirmed the severity of the attack Melissa suffered, which, according to forensic doctors, would not have been fatal had she received timely medical help. The detectives in charge of the case revealed chilling details, confirming she suffered cranioencephalic trauma and had 11 sharp force injuries. The worst part was that they estimated she had agonized for approximately an hour. Recent sexual abuse was also indicated by injuries, but no genetic material could be retrieved. From that moment, Luis became a focus for the prosecutor, who could not ignore the 2014 precedent. Meanwhile, chemical tests performed on the seized utensils found traces of the victim's and her mother's DNA, particularly on the knife used in the attack. The prosecutor's office revealed crucial details about this evidence. The knife used in the attack had a distinctive tip damage, matching the injuries and fractures on the teenager's skull. Moreover, it wasn't just that the mother's and daughter's DNA was found, but where it was located. According to the Legal Medical Service, Melissa's genetic material was on the blade, and a significant genetic fingerprint of Mirta was on the handle. Chemical tests also showed that after being used as a weapon, it was washed to remove blood traces. With all this evidence supporting a case beyond reasonable doubt, on February 2, 2021, Mirta was arrested as the alleged perpetrator of the crime. Later, the police provided details including their knowledge of the events. At the formalization hearing, the public prosecutor charged Mirta with the crime of homicide. After presenting a video that evidenced the chronology of the event, the prosecutor pointed out the absence of eyewitnesses, the mother's attempt to erase all evidence, and the short span between her departure and the smoke sighting. In summary, for the public prosecutor, it was a passionate and ferocious crime. Although the defense insisted on her innocence, the prosecutor dismissed the idea outright. During the investigation, Mirta was held in preventive detention for 6 months. However, the public prosecutor's office still needed to investigate the nature of the relationship between Luis and the minor. Aware of his precarious situation, Luis fled. Despite authorities' efforts to locate him, neither relatives nor friends had any information about his whereabouts. In parallel, a multitude of neighbors and family members expressed their condemnation of Mirta, demanding justice for Melissa, while the house became a symbol of commemoration and protest. Mirta's defense attorney challenged the decision to keep her detained during the investigation period, but on February 10th, the Court of Appeals confirmed the preventive detention measure against Mirta. One of the most affected was obviously Gina Melissa's paternal aunt. Amid her grief, she criticized the failures of a system that, in her opinion, did not adequately follow up with the family or verify that the mother was qualified to regain custody. She was particularly outraged that the authorities had not ensured Mirta and Luis's separation. Eventually, the various efforts to locate Luis yielded results on Wednesday, November 17, 2021, when he was discovered in the upper area of Coquimbo. He was handed over to justice, facing charges for repeated abuses of a minor. The next day, the defendant was made available to the Court of Guarantees. During the hearing, the prosecution presented further details of the crimes he had committed against Melissa. After hearing the arguments of the prosecution, ordered preventive detention for Luis and his admission to jail, arguing that releasing him posed a danger to society. Meanwhile, on November 29th, the prosecution formally charged Mirta and added a new charge for being an accomplice to the sexual crimes committed by her partner against her daughter. Nearly a year later, on September 23, 2022, the investigation's closing hearing took place. That day, the arguments of the parties to justify continuing the trial highlighted the testimonies of fellow inmates from the penitentiary where Mirta was held in preventive detention. They pointed out that Mirta dedicated all her time to taking care of her appearance and never showed remorse or sadness for how she had acted against her own daughter. They also presented a psychological profile of the accused, indicating to the court that she did not understand empathy but was very familiar with manipulation, as she had provided details and information from the beginning to distort her actions and divert suspicions that arose around her. They stated that Mirta was a person with a preserved reality judgment, aware of the illegality of her acts and the consequences of her actions. This made her culpable as she presented a personality disorder but no loss of contact with reality. Awaiting trial, the regional prosecutor announced he would request life imprisonment for Mirta. For Luis, he would seek a sentence of more than 20 years in prison. On January 21, 2023, just before the trial began, Mirta was urgently transferred from jail to the hospital due to complications from kidney stones. Her hospitalization became public through a photo leaked on social media, prompting criticism from the defense team for the lack of privacy for their client. 3 days after a successful operation, she was discharged and returned to prison. Given the extreme gravity of the events and the fact that they involved a minor, The Child Rights Defense Office requested that the hearings be conducted without media presence. During the last preparatory hearing for the trial, the defense attorney focused on the absence of genetic material to dismiss the accusations against Luis. Ultimately, considering the evidence presented by the public prosecutor's office insufficient, the court dismissed the charges, and instead of preventive detention, Luis was placed under house arrest with a prohibition on leaving the country. Despite this decision, he still had to face a trial. Mirta was not as fortunate. Despite her lawyer's efforts, the highest judicial authority determined she should remain in preventive detention. The trial for Melissa's case took place on April 23, 2023. Presenting a detailed chronology of the events leading to the tragic outcome, the prosecutor asserted that all evidence pointed unequivocally to Mirta, a woman whose jealousy led her to see a rival in her own daughter. To support her case, security camera footage was exhibited in court. The defense criticized what they considered a lack of thoroughness in the investigation, arguing that other leads that could have led to the real culprit and not Mirta were not sufficiently explored. The defense attorneys requested that the court consider their client's substantial cooperation since the beginning of the investigation, initially as witnesses and later as defendants. They proposed a sentence of 10 years for homicide and 5 for arson for Mirta, and a 3-year and 1-day prison sentence for Luis. However, both the public prosecutor and the case advocates opposed all the requests. On May 17, 2023, in a unanimous decision, the court found Luis and Mirta guilty of the charged crimes. Following the verdict, the prosecutors thanked the support of civil society and the entities involved in the investigation, including the experts from the forensic laboratory. On May 27, 2023, the court sentenced Mirta to 33 years in prison, 18 for homicide, and 15 for being the author of a consummated arson. Luis Santander was sentenced to 10 years and 1 day for repeated sexual abuse of Melissa Chavez and was prohibited from engaging in activities involving minors. The case deeply shocked Chilean society, and though the sentences could not reverse the irreparable loss of Melissa and the life she could have had, they brought some consolation to the community with the effective action of the judiciary. Dear viewers, this concludes today's story. Remember to subscribe and leave a like to let me know you appreciate my work. Good night.